Alright, so I've been having some people ask me to do a build breakdown on the Probe, which is, you know, a car that makes between 400 and 500 wheel horsepower at 33 pounds, based on some 0 to 60, or excuse me, 60 to 130 numbers and trap speed in the quarter mile on the draggy. Haven't got it on the dyno yet. I'm still trying to find somewhere in Spokane that I can get a dyno. And then when I do, I'll prove the numbers. I'll be posting draggy runs when it warms up and the snow melts. But until then, I'm just going to do this build breakdown for the people who've been asking, because this car is actually not that expensive to make pretty goddamn fast. So let's get started. So first and foremost, the car. I picked this car up in Clarkston, Washington. I traded a set of wheels that a friend of mine gave me. They were Centerline Galaxy billet wheels that had some bends in them, and I kind of straightened them out the best I could and traded straight across for this car. Clean title. Said the engine was blown up and it just had an intercooler pipe blown off and a bad thermostat. Fixed those and the car ran and drove perfect. So I could go through all the iterations of this car, but the breakdown of all those different prices would take a lot longer and the video would get really convoluted. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna break down the cost from a factory vehicle to get to the point that I'm at now. So starting with a factory Ford Probe GT, you're looking at 140 wheel horsepower, 190 foot-pounds of torque at the tires on a real healthy low mileage car. That's what they left the factory with. So for this setup, I'm actually running pretty much a bone stock engine with some tricks. So the first thing that I did was I changed out the rod bearings for ACL tri-metal race rod bearings with a really good like Teflon coating on them. And what that does is it allows for the higher cylinder pressures and a reduction in the oil film on the crankshaft without having excessive wear on the rod bearings or the crankshaft from contact. The next thing that I did was I got a cheap set of MPR steel rings and I gapped them wider. I think factory gap is 18 thousandths and I'm at about 28 thousandths on the second ring and 30 thousandths on the top ring, to make sure that she's got plenty of gap for some high cylinder pressures, because I run a really interesting fuel. I run race gas ultra concentrate. It's like an octane booster, but it's not. It's actually like a race gas concentrate. They claim it takes pump gas and gives it the RON equivalent rating of 112 octane. I don't trust that, but I have taken the car over 30 pounds on an HX35 on that fuel with over 12 degrees of timing and not had a failure yet. So the next thing you're going to want to do is get rid of the factory graphite head gasket in favor of a Felpro Printo Seal multi-layer steel head gasket. It's like a cardboard coated multi-layer steel kind of jam with reinforced fire rings around the cylinders. And then you're going to take your factory head bolts, if they're in good condition and they haven't been stretched, no blown head gasket, etc., you torque them to 75 foot-pounds instead of the factory 67 or 59 to, I think it's 59 to 63 foot-pounds in the book. You want to take them up to 75. That gives you extra clamp load. They're non-torque to yield head bolts, and I've reused a set 6 times before and had healthy running engines that had broken pistons. So they're really strong head bolts from the factory. I believe they're 13 millimeter. Okay, the next part to note is the valve springs. The factory valve springs aren't going to take much over 300, 350 wheel horsepower before you start floating valves, and you really risk dropping an intake valve. They're famous for it at high RPMs with high boost on a big turbo. So you take the dual valve spring out of a Mazda B2200 pickup truck, and then you install them to the same spring height with the B2200 retainer shims and keepers, or in the factory keepers, on the factory valves. So you get 75-pound dual springs that can handle pretty much any horsepower level these engines can make, and up to 7,000 RPM, although I wouldn't suggest going much over 6,800 because these engines don't make power up there anyway. They're more of a low RPM torque engine. They're not really meant to rev high. Even with a big turbo, anything much over 6,800, you're just breathing hot air. So this particular car has factory castings on the head. And the manifold is just a factory cast iron manifold that I welded a T3 flange and 2-bolt tile wastegate flange onto with a nickel chromium rod with preheat and post-heat, and it's never cracked in over 5 years of having no turbo support bracket and having the weight of the exhaust, the turbo, the intake, and intercooler pipe hanging off of it. So I know that the weld took. I'm not saying it'll last forever, but these factory manifolds can be welded if you weld them properly. For the trans, I have a trick gear setup in it that I'm testing. I'll reveal that later on. Some people already know, but I don't want to get into it this video. And I have an M factory helical diff, but the gears are stock, and it's got drive shaft shop 800 horse axles in it. But I'm gonna throw stock axles back in it and probably sell those to somebody else, because the factory 28 splite axles, I've never broken one. So now we're gonna get into the build cost. So my intake with the Spectre filter and the pipe was a total of $60. I have AWR poly trans mounts. Those were $221 shipped. My drag pack wheels inside were 26 by 8.5 Hoosier drag radials on Jegs wheels. That was $400 total. I did manual windows and manual seats and gutted the rest of the car to save on some weight. So you can see it's got the crank style handles, the manual seats. That saved me about 150 pounds between the seats and the door internals with the motors and everything. I went through 7 stock turbos and 7 non-turbo piston engines before I switched back to the factory low compression Hyperutectics. That cost $4 grand. This built head cost me 500 bucks, plus, or that was including $100 to have it repaired when I blew the head gasket and it torched the head this last time. So I'm 500 bucks into the cylinder head the way it sits. The M factory helical LSD that resides in that trans, plus the cost of the car that I got the gear set out of, was 250 bucks for the car and $831 shipped for the differential. Now for the turbo kit, the wastegate is an EMUSA tile wastegate clone off of eBay. Works perfectly fine. After 6 years, the diaphragm failed, and I just bought a whole nother wastegate for less than a tile wastegate diaphragm costs. Swap the diaphragms and it's good again. That was 75 bucks. My blow-off valve is a Greddy Type S clone. It was $60 new, and it's never failed except for blowing the O-ring off of it. I replaced it with a high quality urethane O-ring and I've never had a problem. The spring is fine in it and has been this whole time. Never has leaked boost all the way up to and exceeding 33 pounds. My piping for the intercooler system was $100 with clamps and couplers. And I had to get a couple of unique couplers to make the kit fit, and those were included in that cost. The turbo is an EMUSA billet wheel 56 mil HX35 with a 360 degree hull set thrust, and it was $294 shipped. The intercooler I bought off a friend of mine, it was too big for his setup. I got that for 60 bucks. So the side pipe and the wastegate dump tube I fabricated myself. With the heat wrap, it was $120 total, but most of that cost was having the original dump tube done by, or side pipe done by Dave's Muffler. But I exploded that and actually blew it to pieces out of the side of the car because I had a triggering issue, and it loaded up on fuel and it ignited in the exhaust and just blew the whole exhaust apart. So I redid that with a 3-inch exhaust when I got the hull set. It was originally done for my T04B setup that I had on it, little 50 trim eBay turbo. And so I'm $120 into the exhaust work. I got bronze shifter bushings from a guy on Facebook in one of the probe groups. I cannot remember the name of the company. I'll have to look it up. But those were $38 for the front and rear bushings to do them out of bronze so that I didn't have to worry about the shifter bushings going bad, which is a really common problem with these cars. In fact, if you find one today driving, it's 90% of the time they have bad shifter bushings, and people think the trans is bad. Oftentimes, if you replace the shifter bushings, the tranny actually works perfectly fine, but these are kind of sensitive to bad trans bushings, and they can cause some internal failures like bent shift forks and shift gates actually breaking from a misalignment of the shift rod. As I mentioned, this has drive shaft shop 28 spline axles. Those were $1,464 shipped, but I'm probably going to sell those because I don't think they're necessary. I might hold on to them for a couple of runs with stock axles to make sure they don't break, but I honestly got them because I thought I would need them, and I do not think that I do. So the clutch is a custom clutch made by Clutch Specialties in Atlanta. It's basically a clone of an ACT Extreme Duty HD pressure plate with a 6-puck sprung ceramic cerametallic disc, and that was $294 shipped, and it's held all the power I can throw at it. For the fuel system, it has a Walbro 255, which was $115 shipped. It has a Fuel Lab adjustable fuel pressure regulator, 1-to-1 rising rate. That was $228. All the AN lines on the car for the catch can, the oil setup and fuel setup was all $460. And the injectors, the DW780s, I was actually given as a gift, but those retail for $380. And then the Hallman boost controller that's on the car, that was $60 or $70, excuse me. And then getting into the standalone. So currently I'm tuning and have tuned the car on Megasquirt 2 version 3.57. But originally the car was actually tuned on a DIY PMP, which I had built by a guy here in Spokane named Glenn Fisher, who was a friend of mine, but we had a falling out. Not going to get into that, but he built it wrong. He built it, honestly, I believe he was just reading the instructions backwards, because when I brought it to a reputable tuner and he went through it, he said it was amazing that it hadn't fried the ECU with how improper things were built. So I had him fix it, and then we initially got the car to work on the factory triggering system in the factory distributor, because I wanted to use a stock ignition system. I didn't want to have to do a trigger wheel and, you know, coil packs or any of that jazz. So that ended up costing me in the neighborhood of, like, between him building me the ECU, buying the actual kit, and then having it fixed and then getting it tuned, about $2,000. Then I met my old tuner who actually basically kind of taught me how to tune, and now that's why I tune my own car. His name is Mike Bonnet. He goes by Megasquirt Mike, and no, he's not a porn star. So he actually has a 7M GTE Mark I Supra, and he wanted the DIY PMP to use the microsquirt to control his automatic trans that he's using in that car, which I believe is a Toyota like AOD or whatever equivalent that's in the Supras, the 2JZ's Supra Autos, I believe. And he actually traded me straight across for the MS2 and built a jumper harness so that I could plug and play into my factory ECU plug and components, just like the DIY PMP. So he built a really cool jumper harness setup, and it actually turned out to be really clean. Let me show you here real quick. So as you can see, it just plugs into the normal Megasquirt plug, but then it spiders off and plugs into my factory harness plug down there with a little data box that's all waterproofed because this car leaks horrendously. And yeah, you can see there's standing water in the bottom of this car from the windshield leaking. This thing's gonna be a rust bucket soon, but he traded me straight across for that, and it actually unlocked some extra features that really help now with the car. So the total cost that I have into the ECU setup between tuning, dyno time, the original DIY PMP setup, and the Megasquirt is about $3,000 between dyno time, paying him to tune the car at $30 an hour, paying him to build the ECU, to fix the original one, all that stuff. Ends up being about $3,000. For an exact number, it was $2,260 total that I spent on the actual DIY PMP setup between everything, sensors and tuning and dyno time and everything, and paying the first guy, buying the kit, paying Mike to fix it. And then for the MS2 with the tuning that we did after that, on the original T04B setup, the dyno tune that I got that made 330 wheel and 370 torque at the tires at 26 pounds on a T04B50 trim, that was $890 total for street tuning. And then the actual dyno time, like paying for the dyno, was $360 total that I spent over the course of a lot of failed dyno days and some other stuff. My gauges, boost, wideband, oil pressure, between them $400, but part of that was getting a new O2 sensor, because when I had that exhaust explosion, it actually blew the O2 sensor out and like ripped the wires out of it and shit. So I had to get a new O2 sensor, which was like 80 or 90 bucks for an LSU 4.9 or 4.5. But yeah, so I'm $400 into gauges and sensors. And then for the suspension and wheels and tires, we can go outside of the car and I'll show you that. So these wheels are 16 by 8 inch 5 Ziggin FN01 RCs. And there's kind of a funny story about these wheels. So for about 10 years now, I've been a mechanic on the side, and for one of my big customers, his name was Travis Campbell. He had an R32 Nissan Skyline GTR. He had an RB2240SX, which I did a lot of work on both those cars. Tore down both the engines, helped him put them together, helped him with his 2JZ and his wide body RX-7. Stitch welded the GTR for him, the front end, just a whole lot of stuff. And so he was selling the 5 Ziggin FN01 RC wheels and asked me if I could get rid of them for him, and I was looking for a new set for the probes, so I just decided to check the lug pattern and center bore size and everything, and it was perfect. Like literally, I couldn't think of a better wheel for this car. I just personally think it looks so good with the FN01 RCs on it. But funny story, he's the guy who gifted me my Turbo Buick Regal for being his mechanic. I actually beat that car racing him when he owned it in this car, and he saw how excited I was to basically beat the Sleepers Regal, you know, turned down a little bit. And yeah, he gave me that car as a gift for being his mechanic. So I have $400 into that wheel setup. Obviously tires, the car goes through a lot. So I've had probably 10 or 12 sets of tires on this car in 10 years of owning it. And it gets expensive, so I'm not gonna count that, but that's probably in the realm. I usually buy used tires, so I'd guess I'm in the realm of $800 maybe total in tires that I've spent, not counting my drag radial setups. For suspension, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see, but the car is on a Yanaka coilover setup for a second gen probe that had to be mildly modified to fit. But they work really well. They're 2 or 3 years old now, and I've had no problems so far with those coilovers. And those, if I'm looking at my sheet properly, those Yanaka coilovers were, oh, where are they at? Where are they at on here? I don't know. I don't know where the hell they are, but they were, I think, $495. I don't know. But yeah, so like $495, and then new strut mounts all around was another $110. So if we look over the total, I have to include I forgot to include the coilovers and mounts, which are another $610. So that brings the total cost of building this car, including all the engine failures and a couple of broken trans, to $16,327 and some cents. And that's on the low end. It's probably about 20 grand I've spent on this car. So if you want to build this car, the actual cost is about 16 grand. Not including labor. That's if you do it all yourself. With labor, you're looking at 35 to 40 probably. Well, I guess not that much. You're probably looking at another 10 grand in labor. So let's say 25 grand. Something to keep in mind is that I did the fabrication and welding on my car myself, as well as the engine and tranny builds and stuff like that, so I saved a ton of money on labor. But to have somebody else do it's going to cost you a lot more money. I just wanted to say, if you made it this far, make sure you give the video a like. If you could do that for me, please. I'm trying to help grow the channel. Make sure you subscribe. Got a lot of cool videos coming out on my probe, the Buick, and my 3S GTE swapped Celica as soon as spring hits and it warms up a little bit. So comment down below what you want to see out of all those cars. Let me know what you want to see with the probe. Let me know what you think of the channel and the video, and I hope to see you next time.